Welcome to Critical Issues, Alternative Views. I'm Ron Kramer, Professor of Sociology at Western Michigan University, and I serve as the host of our program. And with me today are our two regular commentators. Happy New Year to both of you. On my right is Regena Nelson. Regina is in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies at Western Michigan University in the College of Education and Human Development. And Don Cooney probably needs no introduction, but Don is a professor in the School of Social Work at Western.
Yep.
And he's also a Kalamazoo City Commissioner, doing good work as always in that role. Well, our focus for this particular program is on Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His holiday is coming up next week, and Don, you and I have long tried to organize some kind of an event around MLK holiday to focus on King and to particularly focus on the last few years of his life when he took on a couple of other issues other than dealing with civil rights and racism, took on the war in Vietnam and poverty. And so often people talk about the radical King. And of course, Cornel West has written that great book where he pulled together King's speeches and quotes. I think Daniel and Larry can put it up on the screen here in a little bit. But Cornel West's book is titled The Radical King, and you and I have adopted that title for some of our events, and we're going to do an Ali class later this year. But so there's a notion that the radical King, the latter years of his life were somewhat different than the earlier years. But you argue that there was sort of a consistency throughout. So why don't you, I know you have a particular perspective on that, so why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, Ron. I think King was always radical. But how he exercised that radicalism changed during his life. And I think also that his analysis of what it meant to be a radical person deepened as his life went on. He began his really public life in 1955 at Montgomery. And he was in the South, and he was trying to combat the racism that was expressed in the South, which was total humiliation and discrimination. And that was the focus of his struggle from about 1955 up until around 1965. So 10 years there. And we know the depth of that struggle and so much that went on. And his radicalism, I think, was expressed in his dedication and his activism in the face of tremendous pressure and danger to his life. And but I think in 1964 he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and he accepted it in 1965. His perception changed because he then began to see that his responsibility was not just to black people in the United States, but to the world. When he accepted the Nobel Prize, he said, "I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals for their day, culture and education for their mind, and dignity, freedom, and respect for their spirit." So he began to say, I have to look at this more broadly. I have to look at what's going on in the world. And shortly after that, he did speak out sort of quietly against the war in Vietnam, but not to the way he would be later. And then after 1965, he moved the struggle into the North. And when he moved the struggle into the North, he began to look at the economic situation. And his analysis, I think, deepened that civil rights, voting rights were not enough, that he had a struggle for economic justice. And for the last 3 years of his life, I think his main struggle was on economic justice and human rights. So his radicalism deepened, and I think the way he expressed that radicalism changed.
Okay. It was always there. There was a level of consistency, but it deepened as we went on, as he went on, and then he began to apply it to new issues later on in his life.
Right.
So we'll try to cover some of those perspectives. Regina, you're a bit younger than Don and me. What are your memories of Dr. King?
So I was born in 1968, the year he was assassinated. So it's, mainly through school. So, we would talk about history, and then there's always a footnote of the boycott and civil rights, and he's explained there. But I think it is very limited. And so that is one of the things now that we need to work with educators. And I know at Western we'll have a teach-in every year. And it was led by some of the education professors to make sure that we're getting the whole story, like the radical side, to help students understand the role of Dr. Martin Luther King. But for me, in my generation growing up, it was very limited into just snapshots of some of these things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And when the official King holiday came around, which was in the 80s at some point, I believe, I think it was Ronald Reagan that actually signed, despite the fact that there was considerable opposition in his own party. But it seemed like after Dr. King became memorialized with an official federal holiday, that his image became even more sanitized by the mainstream, by conventional politicians. And a lot of the radicalism was stripped away or not acknowledged. And, I think, unfortunately, for some Republicans, for some conservatives, the only line of any speech of Dr. King's is from, the I Have a Dream speech.
Right.
And they can kind of bring him down to a point where he's talking about the content of your character. But again, it takes him completely out of the larger context in which he was operating, and sanitizes him and de-radicalizes him. So we've tried in our presentations over the year to restore the radical King, to bring out those parts of his life and work that did express a more critical analysis of American society and American foreign policy, and to point to the fact that he was a staunch advocate for certain kinds of structural changes in American society. And that he wasn't just, it would have been enough, of course, to lead the struggle against Jim Crow, institutional and personal racism in the United States, but he did broaden his perspective. He did tie, he knew that struggle had to be tied, as you said, to the struggle for economic justice, that you couldn't advance that struggle unless you spoke out against this war in Vietnam, which he said was a giant suction tube sucking up all the resources that could have gone toward economic justice.
Right.
And so he felt, and it cost him too. It really did cost him. I mean, Lyndon Johnson was furious with King when he spoke out against the war, and he lost other supporters, and even other folks within the civil rights movement. We were saying, Martin, you got to keep your eyes on the prize. You got to keep the focus here. But King certainly felt that he had a moral obligation and a larger intellectual obligation to draw the connections between all of these different issues.
I think one of the Vietnam speech on August the 4th, 1967. No, it wasn't April the 4th, 1967.
Yes.
I think that summarizes where he's standing at the end of his life. And he's talking about three things. He says the three great evils of materialism, militarism, and racism have to be attacked. And that's where he came to. when he's talking about materialism, he's talking about capitalism. He's talking about the economic system that is in place in the United States, and that has to change. And he talks about a radical reconsideration of our values. And then he connects that with militarism, which drains the resources that we need to create economic justice here, and also puts us on the wrong side of history. He talks about that. And then finally the racism, which permeates all that kind of thing. Right, yeah. So I think that summarizes where he is at the end of his life.
Yeah, and I think his stance on Vietnam is also, it shows the overlap with the racism and militarism, because here you are sending boys off to fight a war, particularly black youth, to fight for rights in another country for other people that they don't even have rights right here. Right. So how is that justified? There's no way there. So that was another thing that he emphasized when we look at this. And then his overall stance on violence, if we used violence and war to solve problems, and then we see the same things in our own country, how can we say that that's wrong when you see youth using violence? And so I think that alignment and consistency with our values and morals, he just always spoke out about that and spoke truth to power about that. Yeah.
One of the more interesting things for me is how Malcolm X was moving closer to King at the end of his life, and Martin was moving closer to King, to Malcolm at the end of his life. At the end of his life, I believe that Malcolm had broadened his vision that he could work with white people, that there were white people out there who were committed to justice, and he could work with them. And then secondly, Malcolm, who in the beginning wanted nothing to do with politics, now saw that he had to be involved in politics. Malcolm always had that deep understanding of the need for economic justice. He had that. At the end of King's life, he's entirely in that direction. He's seeing that none of this is going to matter unless we do something about economic justice and give people access to the resources that they need to lead a fully human life. So they're coming close. And I think it's wonderful that on Monday at Western, that Malcolm X's daughter is going to be the keynote speaker or the teach-in, and to unite Malcolm and Martin as they were in life.
Now, we mentioned the book by Cornel West, which is an edited volume of King's writings and speeches, but there's also a major new biography of King that has come out in the last year, and it's gotten rave reviews by Jonathan Igg, and it's called King, A Life, I believe. There we have it up on the screen. And I think one of the things that Igg contributes in this book is a deeper analysis of the relationship between Malcolm X and King, right?
Right, exactly. Because there was a picture of them being diametrically opposed. And actually, I believe that their staffs kept them apart. They only met one time. And that was by accident when in I believe it was 1964, when they were both in Washington advocating for the Voting Rights Act. So they never really came together. One of the things that I read in Cornel West's book that I didn't know before, Malcolm had brought the United States before the United Nations for their oppression of black people. And I didn't notice that, but in the FBI had tapped Martin's phone, and they found a transcript of one of his calls to Malcolm, congratulating him and giving him his support for that taking it. So they kept them apart in life, and then Malcolm was tragically killed in 1965, just as King was moving tremendously in that direction. But at the end of his life, King is talking about the things that Malcolm, they differed on the question of nonviolence. There's no question about that. And Martin was completely committed to nonviolence, never moved off that. Malcolm had said any means necessary, but there's no evidence that Malcolm ever shot or killed anybody. There's no evidence of that. He never did that.
Yeah. So I think we can recommend Jonathan Igg's new biography for people who want to know more about King. I mean, it's the first major biography of King since I think David Garrow's excellent book, Bearing the Cross.
Yes.
But that's a little bit more dated, and of course, Egg had access to many more documents to draw on to.
It's a wonderful book.
To give us a more complete picture of Martin's life. You mentioned the Montgomery bus boycott. This was King's entry after, getting his PhD and starting his ministry. And the story is that he was a little bit reluctant because he was so young and he was new to the area to get involved in the bus boycott, but he kind of got pushed out there. Maybe he felt it was a bit premature, but he got pushed out there. And of course, this was when Rosa Parks famously refused to give up her seat on the bus. And of course, Parks was a committed activist as well. It wasn't just that she was tired that particular day. She was a committed activist. She had trained to be part of this movement. And Martin got caught up in that and got pushed to the front. And that kind of launched his career, if you will, as a civil rights activist, maybe a bit earlier than what he wanted or thought. But of course, he threw himself into that struggle, which ended up being a successful struggle. And the Montgomery bus boycott has become one of the most famous incidents in American civil rights history.
Yeah, there's a couple things about that. King had not yet finished his dissertation.
Okay.
And he chose Montgomery because he thought it was a quiet place and that he could go down there. He just started a family and he would have time. He liked that there were some middle-class black people down there he thought he'd start some study groups and he would be able to finish his dissertation. But he was only 26 years old. And when that broke out, the first night they had this mass meeting. They asked if he would speak. And when he spoke, they thought, well, here's the leader.
Here's
we
the
got
guy.
him.
Here's the guy right here.
And that's it right there. And of course, Ike tells that story about, his house was bombed. He was arrested. And he was getting phone calls all the time, threatened he had to leave. And Ike tells a story which is been told by many that one night near midnight, he was alone in the kitchen. He got a call from a guy who was particularly violent and told him that he had 5 days to get out of town or he and his family were going to be killed. And he was scared. And he knelt down and prayed, and something happened because he got up and decided that he was never going to leave there. He was never going to leave that struggle. That was going to be his commitment. And he never backed down after that. Another thing about the Montgomery boycott that is interesting is that when that began, the people that were involved in the civil rights movement sent down Bayard Rustin, who was the organizer. King was a great speaker, but Rustin was the organizer. And he came down and really put together that campaign, and which caught national attention and really put civil rights on the public agenda.
There's a new movie about Rustin, which people should probably know about. And he's often ignored. He was, because he was a gay man, he was sort of pushed to the margins of the movement, I think.
Yes.
And his genius for organizing and his enormous contributions, I think, are often not recognized as they should be. So hopefully with this new movie, he'll be getting some of the due that he deserves for his contribution to the movement.
I think that the movie is wonderful. And what it really tells is that he was the guy who put together the March on Washington.
Right.
Which makes, was the transformative event. But he was the guy that organized all of that. And it was just tremendous. He just knew how to do it.
Early on in his involvement in the civil rights movement, King became involved with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And this was an organizational entity that would really carry forward much of the thrust of the civil rights movement in the early days. And Birmingham sort of came to be the center point, right? When they decided to go to Birmingham. Can you tell us a little bit more about that story, Don?
Yeah. They got the Supreme Court decision in 1956 for Montgomery. And as you mentioned, Ron, they organized then the Southern Christian Leadership Conference because they saw that the church could be a focal point for organizing people. You already had people there. Other voices were arising at that time. There were the sit-ins. King didn't organize those sit-ins. It started with 4 black students in Greensboro, and then it spread. Within a month, there were 100 sit-ins. And then there were CORE organizing the freedom rides down there. So King was continuing to speak around the country, and he was continuing to try to put the issue on the public agenda. But they weren't having a lot of success, and he was brought into Albany, Georgia. There was a movement there to try to desegregate the city. And he was brought in after it started. So he didn't have a chance to really be in the beginning of this thing. And that movement pretty much failed. And he felt that they were losing their stand. They were losing their strength, and they had to do something serious. And so they picked Birmingham as an all-out place to organize where they were going to, it was either do or die. They felt they were going to lose out. So they had picked Birmingham because there were more bombings in Birmingham than in any other city in the South. And because they knew it was going to be tough. And King said to people, you better think about whether you want to get in this because some of us are probably going to get killed down here. Mm-hmm. But he went into it. And what was special about Birmingham was that he was able to capture television. And this became a focal point for the evening news. And when they finally brought out the dogs and the hoses, and that appeared on national television, that hit people, especially in the North, who knew there was segregation, but weren't aware of how violent the whole thing was. And what was key about Birmingham was it forced John Kennedy to act. Kennedy had been supportive of the civil rights movement, but had been slow to act on legislation because he felt that he needed the votes of Democrats in the South. But shortly after, I think within a week after the Birmingham demonstrations, Kennedy gave a speech on television, which was a wonderful speech and very, very powerful. And he said he was sending a civil rights bill to Congress. And that was a big breakthrough right there.
We should point out that the political problem for the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party dominated in the South. After the Civil War, of course, it was Reconstruction was carried out by the radical Republicans in the Congress. Lincoln had been a Republican, and so the South was solidly Democratic. But the parties began to switch their stances over time, but the Southern problem. So there was a southern wing and a northern wing of the Democratic Party eventually that developed. FDR, carrying out the New Deal, always had to be very cautious to make sure that he brought along the Democratic senators, because if he didn't, his New Deal programs would not pass, right? And of course, this problem persisted, and this is what Kennedy and then Johnson were facing, right? If they took too bold a stance on civil rights, they were going to lose the South. And if they lost the South, that was a very strong base for the Democratic Party, and it would threaten their elections, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, you know, once Johnson did sign the Civil Rights Act in 1964, he's reputed to have said, well, we've just lost the South for a generation. And of course that did happen, right? Richard Nixon's Southern strategy during his 1968 campaign was to, okay, these people in the South who are currently voting Democratic are more culturally and politically conservative. They really belong in the modern Republican Party. And so Nixon could use the race card in subtle dog whistles and other ways to drive a wedge into the Democratic Party, pull away those more conservative Southern voters who were voting Democratic but were troubled by the race issue and the civil rights advances, and would be, you know, could then move into the Republican Party where they would be welcomed. And so that's the part of the political dynamic here that I think we need to make clear, that the shift was underway. And the South, which was solidly Democratic up until the 1960s, would then become solidly Republican, right?
Yep.
And so that's really an important thing to acknowledge. The other thing that came out of Birmingham that I think is important is that, of course, many were arrested, Martin included, and it was at this point that Martin wrote the famous letter from a Birmingham jail. What did he say in that letter, Regina?
Well, I know, of course, he talks about nonviolence, and when he's in jail, he also shares with us that he does talk to wardens, and he starts to help people see the connection that who the oppressor is because of white supremacy culture, and how some of us are in the same boat. It's not just black people, but white people are also being oppressed by this. And so there is a place where we can come together to challenge this system.
Yeah, start making those connections. And of course, we should certainly point out that King was very much influenced by Gandhi, right?
Oh, yes.
Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. And so this is his expression of the Gandhian philosophy of bringing about social change through nonviolent civil disobedience, right? And so letter from a Birmingham jail, the fact that he's located in a jail and he's making those connections is important, but it's also his opportunity to really advance his philosophy and get that out there, and to say that this is the centerpiece of our struggle, that this is a moral struggle, and we win this moral struggle by remaining nonviolent. We're going to violate laws, right? We're going to violate the unjust Jim Crow laws of segregation. We're going to violate these unjust laws. But we do so, we have to accept the punishment for that.
Right.
But it's the moral suasion that comes from that builds a political force to help to bring about then the changes that we see.
Yeah, and I think a couple things about that letter was the context, that was in the middle of the whole Birmingham movement, and a group of white clergymen had written a letter to the editor in the main newspaper there saying, Dr. King, slow down. Take your time. You're rushing too much. We're already working on this. And King wanted to respond to that. And that was his response, where he says, here's why we can't wait. And I think that he wanted to give a sense of urgency to this struggle. This has to happen now. This injustice cannot continue. And I think that's what came out of that letter.
Yeah, so the philosophy of nonviolence from Gandhi, but also, again, King's Christian faith needs to be mentioned because that was so front and center. King often talked about radical love and revolutionary Christianity, and those were centerpieces. And of course, the black church is so essential to the African American community, isn't it?
It is, most definitely. And this idea that, we are motivated for change by love, to build this beloved community for everybody.
Yeah.
And that is, even loving our enemies. That's a hard pill to swallow. That can be very radical, and that's radical love. And so, that's still rooted in the Christian faith and his message.
So this was an essential part of King. And so politically now, the civil rights movement begins to have some successes, right?
Yeah.
It gets the Voting Right, or the Civil Rights Act in 1964. In 1965, we have the March on Selma. And of course, the Bloody Sunday that occurred there, the violent resistance that was encountered. And of course, again, those images of on the Edmund Pettus Bridge of people, John Lewis, a young John Lewis being beat up, and the images of violence and the violent resistance in the South begins to really have an effect on the political system and have an effect on Northern whites. And young Northern whites begin to go south to participate in the civil rights movement. Many who are now involved in what was called the New Left from the late 50s and early 60s, the New Left. Many of those people, like Tom Hayden, cut their eye teeth in the movement by going south.
Yep.
That was one of the things, to go south
Yeah.
among these young liberal white college students, and to go down to Mississippi or other parts of the South to help register voters, right? To break through all the ways in which the system, the Jim Crow system, had set up to rigidly keep African Americans from voting, right? Poll taxes and literacy tests, if not outright violence, to prevent people from even having the ability to register. And so we begin to see an assault on that, and after Selma, then the Voting Rights Act of 1965 gets passed. And so now we're beginning to see some political successes. And of course, it's at this point that King is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for these efforts. And as you said, Don, that considerably expanded his vision of his mission, I think, and the issues that he felt that he would also have to address as a result of now being a Peace Prize winner, Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Yeah, I think one of the tremendously interesting things about the Voting Rights Act, because that was a tremendous victory. I mean, they had won the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. 5 days later, there was a riot in Watts. And King was on vacation in Jamaica. He was exhausted, and he got away and was down there. But he heard about that, and he came back to Watts. And the people there said, "Go home, Dr. King. You don't belong here. You're not here." And he began to see that it was economic justice that these people were fighting for. That and the way they were being treated by the police, they were the two things. But it got home to him. Hey, we just won the civil rights. We just won the voting rights. But we haven't done much at all about economic justice. And that really got him thinking in that direction.
And of course, throughout that time period, starting with Watts in 1965, every year for a number of years, we saw riots taking place in major urban centers, in Cleveland, in Boston, Detroit in 1967, the most deadly riot up to that point, in 1967 in Detroit. And so, obviously there was more to the struggle now, right? Because of this, because of the rioting and because of the violence that went with that, the repression that went with that, King felt that he had to, in a sense, change somewhat of the message. Now, one of the other things that came out of that is that some of the folks kept saying, well, Dr. King, you go out there and talk to those young men to tell them that they shouldn't be doing this. You know, you're the proponent of nonviolence. You should go out and preach to those young men that they shouldn't engage in violence, even if it's if they think it's justified. And King did, of course, talk to many of those young men involved, as you said. But what King drew from that is that, you know, they were saying to me, what about Vietnam?
Right.
Exactly.
What about my government's use of violence to get its way? And King vowed that, he said, I could never speak out against violence in the ghetto without first condemning the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. I mean, think about that statement. I mean, that's a very radical statement. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government. Because of what's happening in Vietnam, because of the militarism in American society. And of course, this had to infuriate Lyndon Johnson, right? And of course, when King then, in 1967, he had started to speak out, as you mentioned, against Vietnam. But in 1967, April 4th, exactly 1 year before his death, we should point out, at the Riverside Church in New York, he went and gave the famous speech, Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. A time to break silence. We've been silent about this issue too long. I have to speak out about it. And it's one of the most amazing speeches you'll ever read, as you mentioned, Don. I mean, I recommend that everyone read that speech. And the depth of the analysis I mean, King studied the issue. He really, really studied the issue. He understood what was happening in Vietnam. He understood it as part of a larger anti-colonial struggle. He understood it as an anti-imperial struggle against this war. And he really sharpened his analysis and again, a much more radical structural analysis of what's going on, what's behind this war. And then he said, I have to speak out against this war. I cannot remain silent. And again, infuriating even others in his own movement, because he was, you know, he was angering the president who had been supportive, right? He was alienating white liberals, perhaps, who had supported the movement, but were still supporting Johnson and the war. And but it was one of the most courageous stances I think any person who's involved in a movement has ever taken, was to give that speech and to step out the way that Dr. King did. And of course, it cost him greatly. I mean, King was a very unpopular person. You know, we have this holiday now in this sanitized version, and everybody professes their love for Dr. King, but he was one of the most hated men in America by African Americans and by whites at this point, because he either wasn't radical enough, or wasn't, you know, talking about by any means necessary, or he was stepping out of line from keeping his eyes on the prize, as they say, or again, because those who supported the war now saw him as an enemy as well. So Dr. King took a very unpopular stance. He was spied on by the FBI. The FBI regarded him as the most dangerous man in America. J. Edgar Hoover was infuriated by King, always tried to see if King had communist connections, and he didn't. You know, he certainly was an advocate for democratic socialism, but he wasn't a Marxist, and he wasn't a communist. You know, J. Edgar Hoover would have loved to have proven that, but Hoover spied on King and pulled all kinds of repressive shenanigans against him to try to besmirch him and his reputation, and it didn't work. Dr. King would not back down.
So it's really interesting, the context of the speech against the war in Vietnam, because by this time, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, he changed his name to Kwame Ture later, they had said that nonviolence is not enough. We got to do more. We're still in miserable conditions in our city. And the Panthers had started in 1966. So there were a lot of people that were saying, look, you did a good thing there in Montgomery and all, but it's time to move on. We need more. So he was losing some people because they felt he was too passive with nonviolence. So that was out there. The second thing was this thing with the president. He knew that if he spoke out like this against the war in Vietnam, he was finished. I mean, he had a strong relationship with Johnson. The day after Johnson took the oath of office, he called King. And he said, I'm going to work on this civil rights movement. I need your help. And they worked together. So to break with Johnson now was a big deal. And as you said, after he gave that speech, the New York Times, the main newspapers in the country came out way against him, saying, you're going beyond what you know. You don't know what you're talking about. You know something about civil rights. You don't know anything about this. You just keep quiet. And I saw that a poll said that 72% of white people were against this speech, and 55% of black people.
Wow.
So he was isolated. Even with his own team, they didn't want him to do this because they wanted him, but he felt he had to do it. He had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that strikes me about Dr. King is at the end of his life, in that last year, how much pressure he was under. I mean, because the FBI was really pushing down on him. He became more and more isolated, and nonviolence wasn't changing the economic system.
Right.
And that's what people wanted to see. So he was under enormous pressure at the end of his life.
Courageous stance, and his ability to withstand that isolation and that opposition because it was the right thing to do. I think there's such a powerful message there. You know, do the right thing in spite of the obstacles, in spite of the pressures against you. Now, as we move on through 67 into 68, King takes up another major issue. Well, he's been dealing with it, the economic injustice, but now he sees a very concrete way to participate in that because of the sanitation strike in Memphis. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. But even before going to Memphis, which is where his life will be ended, of course, but he was organizing a major campaign.
Yes.
At that point. Don, what was going on at that point?
Yeah, well, okay, a couple things. Before, you talked about the riots in 67. At the end of 1966, Hoover, the FBI director, said, there's going to be some riots in 1967. There might be as many as 12 riots, a dozen riots. There were over 100 riots in 1967. And by this time, Johnson was under such pressure for so many other things, but he appointed a committee, the Kerner Committee, under the direction of Otto Kerner, who was the governor of Illinois, to answer three questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And what do we need to do about it? And they gave an excellent report. It came out. And by that was 1968 when it came out. But one of their recommendations was economic justice. Mm-hmm. And so King felt that he had to take a really strong stand. And so he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get poor people from all over the country, not just poor black people. We're going to get poor people from all over the country. Mm-hmm. And we're going to go to Washington and we're going to stay there. And we're going to commit civil disobedience. But we're going to demand that Congress do something about the poverty in the country. And so that started the Poor People's Campaign. Mm-hmm. And that's when, in the middle of that, trying to organize that, he gets this call from Memphis saying, hey, we need you to come down here. And his staff says, there's no way that we can take up anything else right now. We're trying to organize this Poor People's Campaign. We can't do this. But then King says, if we can't stand with the sanitation workers, who will? And what are we for if we can't stand with them? So he goes there, and he's invited to participate in a march. And when he goes, he's 2 hours late to get there. And so he joins, the march is in progress. And as the march is going on, there are radical organization at the back of the parade, at back of the march, which begins to break windows and getting in a fight with the police. And this is the first time that King has ever been in a march that has turned violent. And they get him out of there. They say, we're getting you out of here. He says, no, I got to stay. No, they say, get him out of here. And then newspapers say, Dr. King abandoned the march. He couldn't control the march. Now he knows he's going to organize a march of poor people from the South across the country into Washington. And he has to show that he can control that, or else it's going to be all over. So he decides he has to go back. And that's the context when he goes back. He organizes his people, comes back. They're going to do a nonviolent march. He's going to make sure that that happens. And that's the context that he goes back again. And it's the evening of that when he gives his I've Been to the Mountaintop speech, where he knows that his death is not too long off. Mm-hmm. He says, I've looked over into the promised land. I might not get there with you, but I know that we as a people will get to the promised land. And then the next day is when he's killed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Been to the mountaintop. I might not get there with you, but we will as a people get there. Yeah, one of the most prophetic speeches in American history. Yeah, when you see that speech now and you know what happens the next day, it's just kind of incredible. Again, the courage that it took for King to be part of this effort, even at that point, given all the other pressures and things that are going on. So when we talk about the radical King, we're not just talking about civil rights.
Right.
We're talking about economic justice. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a poor people's march. We're talking about speaking out against the Vietnam War. We're talking about speaking out against imperial violence and the remnants of colonialism in the world. So we're looking at a man who has expanded his vision, expanded his dream, expanded his mission over the in a relatively short period of time. I mean, we forget that Martin was only 39 years old when he was killed. Yeah. He was only 39.
Right.
It's just astounding when you think about that. But think about all the things we've talked about already today that this man did before he was 40 years old, and he didn't make it to 40. So, I mean, I think that's just really kind of incredible. And yet, I think so much of what we've talked about and so much about the radical King is just not known to a larger audience, right? Regina, you were saying when you were in school.
No, we don't talk about all that. It's very narrow around the race issue and, desegregation and
And I Have a Dream.
Mm-hmm. And I Have a Dream, exactly.
As if that were the only speech Martin ever gave.
Right.
Of course, one of the most important speeches he ever gave, 1963, in the March on Washington, an incredibly important moment in American history, in American civil rights history. But it didn't end there, right?
No, not at all.
And Martin continued on. He always liked to say that he wanted to be known as a drum major for justice. Mm-hmm. But I think I'm going to read that section.
Yeah.
And the context here, when Martin gives these remarks, is that he's talking about his funeral. Yeah. What he wants to be known for at the end of his life. If I can get there. Having a hard time getting my notes organized. Here it is. So he's talking about his funeral, and he says, I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try to feed the hungry. And I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. I think that's a powerful statement. Yeah. Yeah. So he was a drum major, and and of course, I think in looking back now, we see the enormous contributions that he made. But again, at the time, very controversial figure, very unpopular figure, and yet I think the fact that we now have a national holiday honoring this man is a kind of belated recognition that he was right on most of these issues, that he was being that drum major, and he was changing the United States and changing the world through the efforts that he was engaged in.
Yeah, I think one of the things is, if you look at the end of his life, the courage of the man. I mean, he was under huge psychological pressure. He had enjoyed such adulation from the country, and now he was considered obsolete and not independent at all. And he was still continuing night and day to go around the country and talk and to organize on this. In Ike's book, he mentions that at the end of his life, there were 2 weeks when he never even was home. And his wife was such a hero. Coretta was such a hero. She raised those kids. She stuck with him through all this and supported him in all those things. So, I mean, the guy was just such a determined that he felt that God had put his hand on him and had given him this task in his life, and he was going to do it no matter what. That was amazing to me.
Yeah, inspirational. So it begs the question, he's inspired so many. Who is the next leader? Who is the next radical king in our current day political system? Or, who do we see speaking out like this and who's willing to risk it all?
Right. That's a great question. And I'm thinking that maybe today it's not a charismatic leader. Maybe today it's a community approach. It's a group of people who are come together, committed to this, and the goal would be to extend that and to bring more and more people into that struggle. I don't know. The question is, where is the leadership today? And maybe it's not from an individual.
Right.
Maybe it has to be from a group. But we need that kind of leadership that's going to mobilize people.
Right.
And I think that's one of the lessons of King. There's a video called Citizen King, in that video, the guy who made it makes the point that one of the things that King was teaching us was responsible citizenship. That to be a Christian, to be an American, is to be committed to work for justice and to change our country. One of the things about the Vietnam speech, he begins this speech by saying, I'm going to speak tonight not because I hate my country, I am speaking because I love my country. I love America, and I want America to live up to its ideals. So I think that kind of message, I think it is much more difficult today, especially for college students, for young people today, that come out with great debts from their college education and into a very competitive workplace. Students played such a big part in this whole movement. But I think they've neutralized students because they've put such burdens on them that it makes it hard for them to get there.
Yeah, I think what we can draw from King is the idea that we need to build a large, integrated, progressive social movement for structural change.
Yes.
Yes.
And it has to involve militarism, and the peace movement has to be a part of that. It has to deal with racial injustice. It has to deal with structural economic inequality. It has to deal with the climate crisis.
Yeah.
Yes.
That all of these things have to come together into a larger integrated social movement. And whether that movement can come together, I guess, is the big question.
That's the struggle. Yeah. And it has to be international.
It has to be international. Well, unfortunately we're at the end of our time today. Next time we're going to come together, we're going to be looking at the climate issue and the fact that at Western Michigan University, the Climate Working Group has organized a Climate Emergency Spring into Action 2024 series of events. And some of the folks from the working group that are involved in that will be here. So we ask you to please come back and join us then. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thanks to Regena. Thanks to Don. Thank you for joining us on Critical Issues, Alternative Views.